Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that gives you a peek inside the minds of some truly inspirational teachers. This week, I'm delighted to welcome teacher Tom Brassington onto the podcast to talk about all things primary education. In this classic episode, we discuss the key features of Tom's lessons, his approach to leadership, that all-important research thunderbolt, as well as his work in the field of mental health. And I have absolutely no doubt that you're going to love every second. So without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. So Tom, it's great to have you here. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me.
We always begin with our teachers in numbers, our guests in numbers, just to get a feel for who they are, where they're from. So my first question to you is years as a teacher.
6 years, going into my 7th.
Number of schools?
4 schools.
First year group taught?
Year 6.
Last year group taught?
Year 3.
Most important year group?
You're always going to make an enemy in this one, aren't you? I think for me, I've gone with year 3. It's one that I've got a lot of experience in, so I've kind of got a bit of a bias, but I do think it's really, that change from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2 is really often underestimated in schools, and I think it's so important to get that right. I think children quite often, just how they develop emotionally and relationally at that point as well in primary, I think it's really foundational how we get that right. Sort of empathy begins at that point, and that's when they start to grasp that. And I guess for me, if you train them right in good habits at that point, then it's doing a favour to our Key Stage 2 colleagues if they've got it right at that stage. So I'm going to go with year 3 and hope I don't offend too many people.
Yeah, no, it's a devilish question. I'm totally with you, because there's some hard graft in the first maybe 13, 14 weeks of year 3, but then you start seeing the payoff once you get past Christmas, don't you? Definitely. What about your favourite year group?
I've done year 3 a lot, and I do love lower Key Stage 2. I'm still going to say year 6. I think it's a cracking year group. It's that special time that you get with them and to do all those things that make up that last year of primary and those landmark moments that they remember. I think that's really special. But I guess, yeah, that level of engagement as well that you get with those children, the sort of depth of the discussion that you can get to, I think that's really, there's some really powerful stuff goes on in year 6, definitely.
Yeah, I can see that. And number of tweets?
Oh, this is embarrassing. I'm 18.5 thousand. That's pretty bad, isn't it? I actually looked at the number of likes that I've done as well, and it's somewhere in the region of 78,000. And I thought, I'm pretty sure I don't like many things at all, but here I am. So yeah, embarrassing.
I think that's fair enough. I mean, I think that's probably Europa League, maybe pushed into the Champions League places when you look at some of the 34,000s that we've had.
I was going to say, thank God for Shannon.
Yeah, it's really interesting. People always talk about, whenever I ask them, they're all like, they're either really high or really low, but everybody's equally embarrassed.
Definitely.
Really looking forward to this one, because we're going to do a classic episode with all the classic questions. And so you're a teacher, co-creator of Bottle Book, and an advocate for conversations about mental health and emotional honesty. Tell us about your journey and how you got here.
Sure. So I guess I grew up loving 3 things when I was a kid. I loved musicals, I loved going to church, and I loved school. And I think those 3 things those were 3 trajectories I could have gone down maybe. So I loved musicals because I wanted to be on stage when I was a kid, and I wanted to write shows. Stephen Sondheim's my hero, and so I wanted to be like him when I grew up. And then church, I guess, I've always gone to church with my family, and that community that you get there and the chance to inquire and ask big questions, I was always fascinated by that. My Sunday school teacher used to say that I just had too many questions, which I think that was a get out of jail free card for her, but that was always something I loved as well. And then for school, really, it was always about my mates for me. having a laugh. I was a bit of a coaster at school, and I would kind of fly through and do all right. And I think, when grown-ups always used to say the best years of your life, it's what everybody says, isn't it, at school? I was actually one of those people who really felt like that when I was at school. I just loved that environment, particularly secondary. So I did all three, really. I did a degree in music theatre, and did 3 incredible years there, met my wife there, but realistically knew that wasn't a career choice for me. I left uni and worked for my church for a year as well. I did some youth work and stuff like that. And again, similar sort of thing. I knew I wasn't going to be a vicar. And so it was more about keeping my toes in with that and finding other stuff that I wanted to do. And I think sort of the same time that I was kind of questioning that after I'd left work at church, I was thinking, do I want to do secondary or primary? I'd always thought I'd do secondary, but I was in Argos with my mum and dad, and we were buying some stuff for the house, and I saw my year 2 teacher there. Mrs. Ledenham was her name, and she was a great teacher. And it sounds really cheesy, it sounds really kind of cliche, but I got this feeling when I saw her, and it was a feeling of almost safety, and I felt happy. And I thought, if I could do a job where 20 years down the line I see somebody and they still have that feeling, I still remember that feeling, I thought that's got to be a sort of top job to be involved in. So yeah, I did a year schools direct at Nottingham, so 4 days a week in a school in Derby. Had an incredible mentor who I don't really, we never really talk too much about mentors, but they're so valuable, aren't they? And never underestimate the power of a positive role model, I guess. And my mentor, Kim, was fantastic. So I stayed on there for a maternity leave cover. It was the kind of school where everybody stays forever. So they'd all been there forever, and they were all going to stay there forever. So when the maternity leave ended and there actually wasn't a job there, it was kind of quite a nice opportunity for me to get out and try something new. And so then I'm at the school that I'm at now, which is a Catholic primary school in Burton-on-Trent in the Midlands. I did a year during the pandemic, did a year in the city centre school in Derby, and now I'm back at the primary school in Burton. So yeah, I teach year 3 at this school, geography lead, and do quite a bit of work around reading for pleasure for the school as well.
Nice. And I reckon you've got plenty of opportunity to put the musical theatre training to good use.
I love to write an Easter play, put it that way.
So what are the 4 most prominent features of a Mr. Brassington lesson?
So being privy to the questions and kind of thinking about them, classic episode, as you said, I wrote down some ideas, and I was thinking, what are the things that you'd see if you went into my classroom? And I think this is a bit rogue and it's unintentional and it's going to sound ridiculous, but I think it kind of follows the classic structure of a Broadway musical. So bear with me when I try next. I'm going to do like a whistle-stop tour of Broadway musicals in this process. So I think start of Broadway musical, you get an opening number and an I want song. So sort of a place where the character establishes what they want and the audience get to see all of the scene set. I think for me, start of my lessons, I want to establish what we're going to get out of that lesson. So I'll be really clear from the start of that lesson with the children. And also establishing, especially in year 3, where I'm working at the moment, after that transition from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2, I want to establish those rules and expectations for that lesson. And I do that fairly regularly in my class, just so that they're constantly on the brain of the children who are in my class, that they've got that. Yeah, so I think that's the first one, is being really clear on what I want us to be able to achieve together through a lesson. Second, in a Broadway show, every show has applause. So it's that call and response, that chance to I don't get the kids to applaud me. That's not my second feature, is not me getting them to give me a standing ovation. Ultimately, it's call and response, isn't it? And I think getting children involved in the lesson and the learning, I see the value of that. So being able to model first and then get the children involved in that process, having a go, whiteboards, chance to check in with different groups of children. You'll see me doing a lot of circulating of the class, getting my steps up as well. And then I think the third thing, so you get to act 2 of a Broadway show. It's a massive opening. And even if it's going absolutely awfully, act 2, the opener, is that chance to re-establish even the worst shows. And so I think for me, one thing you will see is if it's a nightmare lesson, if it's not going how I've planned, I'm always aware that there is the chance to kind of take a step back and get things back on track. And I think I've learned that probably the hard way, as most teachers do. So seeing those lessons go wrong, those lessons where everybody's quiet and they're doing their writing, and then you read the writing at the end and you think, geez, I probably should have been checking in on that a little bit more. So I think that chance to stop and to check in either on a whole class level or with groups or individuals, I think it's really important, and something that I'd be keen to be doing across any sort of lesson. I think there's a tendency perhaps to not do that as much in lessons in the wider curriculum and things like that. And I think it's just as likely that there will be misconceptions in those sort of lessons. And so it's as important to do that in those as well. And then the end of a Broadway musical has this massive 11 o'clock number, this big character finish where the character comes to some kind of realization about where they've got to in their story. And I think for me, whilst we're probably not going to see masses and masses of progress in every single lesson, it's important to kind of highlight and shine a light on the progress that has been made. I would try to make sure that at the end of every lesson, the children know what we have done, check back to what we said at the start, what were our intentions, and have we got some way to achieving them. And even if we haven't got as far as we would like, I would hope that at the end of a lesson, we can see something that we have done together. There's real power, I think, for children's self-esteem. The children's kind of understanding of themselves as learners, to know that process, to see the progress that they can make as well.
That is a sensational metaphor. I think it's so good that we're going to see a flurry of Christopher Such metaphors coming in future episodes, because he will be displeased that he has been bested in terms, because I can see exactly how, I've got limited experience, but I've been to enough musical theatre to see the key points you're talking about, and the way you have connected to your practices is phenomenal. What do you think happened that brought you to this point? Was there anything in your professional development that sort of, obviously not the metaphor, but the practice, because I'm seeing some really key markers of efficacy. What took place that brought you to this point?
I do throw a lot of it back to that mentor that I had in my first year doing Schools Direct. She really just showcased such skill in the classroom of awareness. That was more than anything else. That's what I noticed, was how aware she was of every corner of her classroom in every lesson, and as well as the awareness of the children in her class, she was aware of her role within the classroom and how effective she was being within a particular lesson. And quite often in discussions we'd have after a lesson, whether it was one that I'd led or one that she'd led, I think what we talk about is how effective were we, and was there anything we missed? So the perk of being in another person's classroom is being able to spot things that they don't necessarily spot. And that's always been a really valuable tool that I've looked back on, especially using sort of support staff or TAs in that role. I find that really powerful. So my TA, quite often I'll say, for this lesson, this particular lesson, just keep an eye out on that group, or make sure that I've covered this, and this, and having them as somebody to bounce off of. I find that really powerful. But I think for me, it has been, it stemmed from that first year of seeing that practitioner being so aware in her classroom of both her practice and what the children are doing. I think that was probably the most influential thing, actually, and to have that so early on was such a benefit, really.
Yeah, I totally see what you mean. Those conversations are essential, and having someone who can help you develop that level of reflection in your practice, is absolute gold. And I think as we move to this coaching model that seems to be part of early career training. I hope those conversations happen a lot more, because certainly when I work with teachers, that the bulk of what I do is that sort of taking them to the next step, and like you said, showing and then asking and talking about it afterwards. I think, I'm thinking about this metaphor. I reckon there's a fourth wall. Do they break the fourth wall in musical theatre?
Occasionally, yeah.
Because whenever I'm like doing a worked example, I will stop and talk to either the teachers watching me or the pupils and explain as if I'm not the person who's doing the modeling. So I think there's legs in that, and I'd definitely be interested to, see you talk about that. What don't know what the vehicle would be, but it sounds really interesting. So how do you try and instigate change on a school-wide level?
I think so. My role at school at the moment, I'm still very much a classroom teacher, and I'm geography lead, and like I said, do some work for Reading for Pleasure as well. I think I've just become so much more aware, the more of this that I'm being involved in more recently, how complex it is. And I think I am still, if I'm honest, at the infancy of truly understanding how to do it effectively, and also in a sort of supportive and collaborative way, really. But I think that the EEF put in a document called Putting Evidence to Work, and it's like a school's guide to implementation of change. And it talks through how you would make research-informed changes in a school effectively. And I think the structure of that document, when I read that through, sort of the start of last academic year, actually, its subheadings, I found them really helpful. So it talks about allowing for time to make change and identifying leaders to cultivate change as well. So I'm not in a position where I could be the person who identifies leaders, but I want to be one of those leaders that's identified as someone who can cultivate change. And sometimes that's as much a part of change, isn't it, in schools as anything else. Being a team player and being someone who's going to support the team in making that change is really valuable. And then it talks about being clear on the problem that actually needs solving and preparing and assessing the readiness for whatever plan you put in place, and being able to solve the problems that come up as you go, so that plan sustains itself over time. And I just found that breakdown was really helpful for me, because it works on like a micro and a macro level. So it could be that you're talking with an ECT about how to implement some research-informed change in the classroom effectively, or it could be that you're talking to a multi-academy trust about how to do it on an academy-wide level. So I'd recommend that as a really valuable piece of reading for instigating change. But for me, if I'm being frank about it, I went back to my school in last September, was given the role of geography lead, and I was completely inadequately prepared for that role. My subject knowledge was appalling. I'm embarrassed by how poor it was, and my understanding of what was going on in the school within that particular subject wasn't great either. So this year really, for me, has been a huge learning curve in how to instigate change. I've had to change a lot of what I do, and I've had to do a lot of reading, a lot of listening to helpful podcasts and a lot of things like that to make sure that I am somebody who can begin to instigate change. It's a real crime that in schools we sometimes have people pushing through change that aren't in any way prepared to do that, or aren't in any way kind of like qualified to do that. And I didn't want to be one of those people. So I guess going to the very foundations of it, putting in that legwork at the start, and then taking the team with you. So constantly checking in with the team and chucking out the stuff that's not working. Checking in and chucking out is one of my sort of instigating change catchphrases.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because you can't put something in unless you're taking something out, because we fill every single second of the day with schoolwork, don't we? Geography is not an easy gig, because, and as you alluded to, subject knowledge, I reckon of the foundation subjects, it has potential to be one of the ones where people haven't really studied it since their own time, perhaps at GCSE. I don't know, is it essential to study geography at GCSE in England?
No, I definitely finished at year 9. That was the last time I'd done geography.
So what's your plan then for upskilling teachers to that level where they're able to confidently teach geography in the way that you've envisaged?
So I think over the past year, it's been leading by example. So I've done a lot of, like I said, a lot of reading and a lot of trying to build up my subject knowledge so that I can support my colleagues if they've got questions, if they've got problems or issues around a particular topic that they're teaching. I need to be the person that has those answers to those questions. So I've tried to get myself to a position where, as best I can support my colleagues with their subject knowledge. And then it was very much about reflecting on what we do as a school and our sequencing of the curriculum. And we actually did a bit of a big chucking out of a lot of the stuff that we were doing. And for me, the key thing that's happened this year in my role as subject lead has been sort of collaborative conversations with colleagues. So having colleagues involved in those conversations and discussions about where we sequence certain areas of learning, how we make sure that certain key things that we want our children to know within that subject, how that then is going to be retained over time and revisited over time. And we're actually in a really good place. So I after a year of really hard work, we've got some really, really good stuff going on. And it was lovely to be able to sit down at the end of last term with both colleagues and with children, and to just chat to them about geography, and know that had we have done that a year prior, we wouldn't be anywhere near what we are now. And so I know when you had Neil and Victoria on, they spoke about the importance of giving it time to develop. And I think it can be really, really tempting to just rush curriculum because you want to make a change that's meaningful for the children now, but we're not necessarily going to see the impact of what we've put in place this year next year. It might be that our current year ones, by the time they're in year 6, have a much more fully formed understanding of what geography is because we've had those 6 years with them. So I think having that kind of conscious understanding that we can't make changes overnight that are going to have an impact overnight has been really important for me. So allowing the time for it to develop, and we're doing similar stuff with our work. I'm working with my colleagues in history and science over the next year to kind of have a uniform approach to it, but also to make sure that we're still taking everybody with us in that approach.
Yeah, my next question was going to be, have you sat down with your history lead and have you mapped out those connections and stuff? So is that a conversation you're going to have next year?
Yes, so we had a couple of conversations back end of last year. So history and science, the three of us are working quite closely together as a sort of curriculum working party, and that's been eye-opening for me as well. I think it's Mary Myatt talks about the fact that the national curriculum is the bare bones, and that's all. Everybody deserves that, but they also deserve so much more than that. And so I think that's what's been really powerful, actually, to be able to have those conversations with my colleagues about what do our children deserve from our geography curriculum or our history curriculum that goes beyond what's expected for them to understand. Those sort of conversations, just loving those at the moment, because they really do kind of, it's a real school vision, and that's really powerful.
That sounds superb. I think you guys have got a really solid approach to curriculum development, and I think I find it hard to imagine that won't be really successful, like you say, in the long term. The pandemic was a gut punch for me because we had made changes maybe 6 years ago, and we had this group who were coming through. Certainly we had a group who were who had received a really high quality maths education for at least key stage 2, and then obviously we had a really disrupted 18 months, but I think taking the time is definitely the right approach, because then you can see just how impactful you've been. I think, so it's definitely tempting in education to rush things, isn't it?
I think it's been nice as well to that idea of taking the staff with you and being that team that's working together to give the best curriculum we can. I've certainly been kind of blown away a little bit by a lot of my colleagues when I have had those conversations either with them or with the children, about what they've included in the curriculum and what we've chosen, and they've perhaps gone and kind of developed an idea that we'd had in a discussion, or maybe even added in an extra thing that they've kind of come across themselves. So our curriculum, it does just kind of naturally broaden, and the skill sets that different staff offer as well is something that's really, yeah, that's been really kind of like interesting to see where we've taken the staff with us, but how they've then taken their own sort of delivery of that in different ways. It's been really good to see.
Some of the teachers I was working with 4 years ago are now teaching maths much better than I could ever have imagined I would teach maths. And so, you know, once people are really invested, they fly with it, don't they? You mentioned retrieval and remembering things over time. What's your approach to that as a school, particularly in the foundation subjects?
So in geography, one of the things that I wanted to make sure we got right was the idea of little and often, and that idea that we're constantly revisiting learning so that it becomes something, so that web of understanding gets wider and gets more kind of detailed. And I know, again, to kind of shout out Neil and Victoria, but I remember listening to that episode of the podcast, and Victoria said she had like a little and often list in her classroom. Well, I kind of nabbed that idea, and now we do it in our school. So we have a little and often list in our classrooms, and that's one way we do things. So it has all the things that we might want to revisit. And I encourage, if I have a visitor come into class, or a head comes in, or anything like that, at any point you can just ask any of those, and we'd love to revisit them, and we'd love the chance to kind of see whether we've got that in the bag, or see whether we need to keep on working at it. So that's one way. But I think as well, planning over time things that are going to be revisited again. Mary Myatt talks about, I think she's spoken about the importance of like themes like covenant in RE. That's something that's going to be revisited across time and across different faiths, and that kind of concept. So similarly, we have similar ideas in geography in our school. So we might look at the idea of exploration over time, and we might revisit different explorers or different aspects of exploration over time. So we look at oceanic exploration, we look at land exploration, and those sort of themes, those golden threads, then they're kind of things that we'll revisit, and hopefully children will bring something to the table, but then also develop that even further through the new lens of that particular year group or that particular topic.
Nice, that makes a lot of sense. You know, I ask because I know a few subject leaders in real life who are asking themselves that very question: how do we change our systems or improve our systems in this respect? So I think it'll be really useful, and I think Victoria will be really pleased that her words have had an impact. You know, because I think Lloyd mentioned something similar. He was utilizing maybe on a broader level, not in the classroom, but certainly, I think it was part of his briefings. He was using it with his staff so he could keep the tools and strategies they were learning about at the fore of their minds. You're the co-creator of Bottle Book with your brother Joe.
Yeah.
I'll ask the same question I ask everyone. Why does the world need this book?
The way I see it, we're living through kind of a turning point in the way that the world views mental health and mental ill health, and actually the way that we validate one another's emotions as well. And certainly over recent years, I think we've made great strides, actually. I spoke with a parent at the end of last year, and it struck me, she was a young parent, and we were talking about mental health, and just kind of like the acceptance and the knowledge around it was there. It's coming through. And so I think that there's some real hope there. But I guess with the pressures of the society that children are growing into, and the pandemic as well, and the way that shook the foundations of our lives, I guess if we're going to support the people in our classrooms in navigating that emotional terrain, that terrain that lies ahead, then we've got to go even further than we have. And so it's got to go beyond emoji check-ins at the back of classrooms or inside out characters. For our staff too in schools, we've got to be concerned about their well-being in a real way. You know, it's not just yoga classes or free bacon butties, it's got to be beyond that. And so we've got to have sustained, meaningful conversations with people we trust over time, and conversations about how we feel. And I think that's not always easy, Certainly, I think for me and my brother as well, we know we've had to have some difficult conversations with people, with one another, with our family, about how we feel and mental health. It's not easy, but I think what Bottled hopefully does is allows children the opportunity to begin to, adults who work with children, the opportunity to begin to facilitate those conversations. And also for the children who are there, it's a chance for them to begin to understand how to articulate how they feel. I guess sort of services around this sort of work are on their knees, and it might not be our key job. It might not be why we're employed. There was a tweet the other day, somebody quoted Doug Lemoff, and I wrote it down. It said, we must build relationships with those that we teach. However, there must be balance with how we spend our time building rapport and being effective teachers. And trying to build relationships without teaching is a dead-end street. And I thought that's the balance that I want in my classroom. I want to build relationships with children where they feel safe, where they feel encouraged to talk about how they're feeling in an appropriate way and be able to acknowledge those emotions and validate them. But at the same time, I want that to be the framework, because I want a valuable education for them, and I want them to be able to be taught in an emotionally safe, supportive classroom where learning is at the forefront. So yeah, I guess for me, hopefully, the reason Bottled's so important is because it will go some way to helping to create those emotionally honest conversations and those consciously compassionate classrooms.
I feel horrible asking the question, but you'll notice that I asked Christopher Such and Shannon Doherty the exact same questions, and those two books, so it's not a book to say, this book isn't necessary. I think it's up there with those that are going to be really essential going forward. And so as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, right, I have very limited experience in this field. If I read the book, I should then have a framework on which to scaffold my conversations with pupils and perhaps other adults. Am I on the right lines?
I think it's important to kind of emphasize the fact that very few teachers are experts in this, and I've done some work, sort of ELSA training, so it's emotional literacy support training. I haven't done any work beyond that other than the stuff that we've done in kind of creating the book with sort of some professional support there as well, to make sure that what we're saying is as best as it can be. What I think the book does is it does allow you that framework. It does allow you the opportunity to consider how best to frame conversations in the classroom, and also I think we've created sort of accompanying teaching resources and things like that, and what they do is allow a sequence of learning, because I think it's important to recognise that is what we're still doing here. So we are still teaching children. It's just maybe not something that's been valued in the past, and it's important to get it right. My brother quite often says about how the fact that when you look at children, quite often they'll come into a classroom and they don't even know they're hot. So you say you have to tell them to take their jumper off because they don't know they're hot. And so if a child's as unaware of what's going on physically in their body, they're going to be similarly unprepared for the emotional things going on in their body as well. And so I think, yeah, our book would support teachers in helping to begin those conversations and consider their classroom as well and what they do in their practice to do that, to do this sort of work.
Obviously I can only speak to growing up in Ireland in the 80s and 90s, but it wasn't on the agenda. As much as my parents might have loved me, it just wasn't necessarily something we would discuss. And I think you're right. I think more people are being open and honest about how they feel, and I think that it seems like that can only be a good thing, because then people will see that it's something that other people are going through.
My family didn't have any experience of sort of mental ill health at all until we were all in our 20s. So me and my brother and my sister were all in our 20s, and so we were completely unprepared. And in some ways, that's where Bottled came from. Me and Joe, when we were both NQTs, spotted similar things in both our classrooms. We spotted that children found it difficult to regulate their emotions, to navigate them, to identify them even, and definitely to express them in sort of safe ways. so yeah, it's been a learning curve for us as well. And I think we have noticed the more of these sort of conversations we have, the more of an easy route it is to go down. It feels a lot more of a supportive space when you do have those conversations and you build that up with other people.
So if schools are interested, or if teachers are interested, there's a Bottle Book website?
Yeah, so we crowdfunded the book last year through the publishers Unbound. So you can check out the Unbound website, and there you can pre-order your copies, or if you want any of the sort. We're working with some multi-academy trusts and things like that. So all of the details about the pledges, the packages, and all those sort of things can be found on that website. Yeah.
You mentioned staff mental health and staff well-being, and a genuine approach that tries to support teachers in what having healthy attitude towards their own mental health. Perhaps is there anything you guys do in school that you think, oh, that this is what other people should really try this, you know, that goes beyond mandatory yoga classes, that kind of thing?
That's the problem, isn't it? I think well-being it's that Trojan horse, and all of these ideas come in and come out of that particular umbrella term, and they all tend to neglect the fact that well-being's individual, and so what works for me might not necessarily work for you, especially with things like time management. One of my best mates at school, if she's not there till 6 o'clock and's got everything that she needs sorted for the next day, she's not going to be able to relax when she gets home. But for me, if I'm not out the door by 4:30, I don't feel like I've got a break. And so it does depend on who you are. And I think it's important that any school's handling of staff wellbeing is personal, and also so personalized as well. So also recognizing the person within it, thinking about their particular context and knowing them well enough. The head of the school that I worked in first was brilliant at she just knew her staff so well. She knew what was going on in their lives. She knew what was going on with their families. She could tell if they were having a rubbish day, and that sort of awareness of your staff, and that sort of being able to then go in and support them on a personal level, I think is really important. It's not easy. Ultimately, if we don't support our school staff when they're not feeling 100%, we're never going to get 100% out of them. So it's really important, I think, to do that. In terms of sort of practical things, we dabbled with all sorts. So we did Zumba, we did bacon sandwiches, we did the whole lot. We've been there. I think what has worked for us is flexibility. So if there's a staff meeting that somebody can't make, either having a recording of something that they can catch on later, or maybe a handout that comes with that. Those sort of things could be quite important. But also being kind of flexible in taking adults time, giving adults time back, sorry. So if you're taking time away from a teacher because they've got to do this, this and this, giving them that time back is really important in some capacity. And that can be managed, I think. It just takes a little bit more sort of planning ahead of time. And I think certainly for my senior leadership team at the school that I'm at the moment, they're really conscious of making sure that if we're taking something away from a teacher in terms of time, or we're adding a pressure on in workload, we've got to make sure that we balance that seesaw so that we're not, so that they're not going to get themselves burnt out by the end of the year.
Yeah, that's really clear. You know, I'm starting to understand the complexity in a whole new light. You know, like you say, at individual level where everyone's different. I think my tipping point is normally those occasions where, like you say, one thing blends into the next, and then you can't remember the last time you actually just stopped and didn't do something or think about something, you know. So yeah, there's no easy fix, but it sounds like, you know, certainly with respect to pupils, but I think with adults too, the bottle book will be extremely useful. You know, certainly I bet there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of teachers like me who are totally ill-equipped, but through this this sort of wonderful thing that you and your brother have created, you know, will be better equipped in future, you know. So yeah, I think that sounds awesome.
I think maybe one of the most powerful things that's come out of the work that me and Joe have done with Bottled is we've had conversations with people who have been impacted by mental ill health in sometimes tragic ways. And we've also had conversations with teachers and leaders who question whether this work is the work that teachers should be doing, primarily because a lot of people don't feel equipped to be able to do this and worry about the safety around that. And I think what's important for me personally is that I want to make sure that a child who comes into my class who's not feeling great, or perhaps who's having a really tough time, I want to make sure that if they need to talk about how they're feeling, I'm an adult that they can talk to. I think it's really important that students look at their teacher and see somebody who they have access to talk to, not just about their learning, but also another point of call, because it might be that that teacher is their only point of call, or certainly somebody who they trust. It might be that that teacher is the only person that they trust. And so we have an immense privilege as teachers, not only to provide an education, but also to provide a pastoral support to the children in our care. To those people who kind of say, is that our job? I just think it's important to say, why wouldn't we want to support our children in this aspect? We look around at the world and we see that there are lots of areas where if empathy was better employed, we'd be in a better place. And so if we can get that sort of empathetic and that supportive network in place from a young age, I hope we'll see in generations to come a better society for it.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I would probably include myself among the people who, when it's suggested that teachers are responsible for another thing, those lists that come out of things that teachers are responsible for, but the way you've described this, it makes total sense. So I'm convinced that you can't necessarily avoid being that person that the pupils trust, because you spend so much of your time with them in a given academic year, don't you? So to be prepared for those instances, I think, is really, really valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting because the NHS now, I think they did some work early on in the year, and they said something like two-thirds of children in schools have a mental. I think it was two-thirds of children who have mental health problems in schools have had contact with a professional, but they deemed teachers to be professionals. So they said that actually, so I think that the role is changing, and whether we like it or not really, and whether it's seen as another thing to add to our never-ending to-do list, why wouldn't we try to weave it into the way that we work with our children more naturally than consider a sort of standalone lesson on this is how you become friends with somebody, or which doesn't have the power that a supportive kind of encouraging friendship classroom might have if it's all year round.
What's the most important message you want teachers, readers to take in this book?
It would be to talk. It would be to make sure that you are talking with people. So yeah, as a teacher, you're talking with people about how you're feeling, whether that's a colleague or a friend or a family member or a spouse, and the same with children. It's to encourage them to talk about how they're feeling. And the more they do that, the more they will be equipped to manage those emotions in appropriate ways.
Being a reflective practitioner is clearly quite important to you. What's your process for reflecting and refining your craft?
Simply, I want to be better every day. I think that's the crux of it. I think we spoke the other day about people doing the work in the profession, and the fact that actually that's what lots of people in our profession just want to do. They want to be better, and they want to do the best by the kids in their class. And I think that's why I choose to reflect on my practice as much as possible, because I want to get better and I want to iron out the things that aren't working. It's that Socrates quote, isn't it? I know that I know nothing, and I'm always wanting to learn. I want to know more. And it's funny. It was 10 years ago. I was in Barcelona with my mates, Lizzie and Alicia. We went for a holiday, and we'd had a few drinks, and we'd had a good old time in Barcelona, and we were laying down at the top of Las Ramblas, which is like a street, one of the main streets in Barcelona, and there's like this little courtyard. We were laid down there, we'd had a merry, merry time, and we were chatting with some locals, and one of them was a chef. And I remember, it's one of those things that just sticks with me, and I can't kind of get it out of my head, but he said, we were asking him about whether it's an interesting job and whether it's boring or whatever, to be a chef in this particular busy part of Barcelona. And he said something like, if I thought I knew how to make the best food in the world, why would I try to do it better the next day? Or he said it was something like that. It might have been less profound. I'd had quite a few drinks, but I remember thinking, that's right, isn't it? If I want to be better, I've just got to be thinking, what can I improve on each time? And that's kind of how I like to try and support the ECTs in our school as well. It's saying we might be failing at all of these things right now, but this one thing, let's see if we can nail that. Because if we can nail that in a couple of weeks, then you know that the children have got something better from you than you could do a fortnight ago. And those sort of little steps, I think that's been really quite powerful. And the reason I can share that with ECTs is because it's exactly how I see my practice still. It's like, what can I improve on? I'm still so new to this profession, and kind of surround myself with people who know so much more than me. And I think particularly over the past year or two of kind of getting into educational research a bit more and trying to understand a little bit more of the complexities of the job that we do every day, I think I just want to make sure that I'm trying to do that in the best way possible. It's like Steve Jobs, isn't it? Stay hungry, stay foolish. That's what I want to. I want to do both of those things. Hungry to get better, knowing that I'm a fool a lot of the time.
I think that's a really healthy attitude, to be honest, because the desire to get better is the first thing that needs to come before anyone is going to get better. But also, the more I know about teaching maths and maths education, the more I feel I don't know. And it's almost, it feeds it, because then you want to know more, and you're going to keep going. I think once you reach the point where you think you've got it cracked, then you're in dangerous territory, because I think things can go downhill very, very quickly. So it sounds like you've got it absolutely spot on. And I think that leads quite nicely into the next question. And it's been a while, about looking forward to asking this one. What is your research thunderbolt?
I've gone with a paper by Daniel Willingham. So Knowledge Matters. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I've actually written down the actual thunderbolt quote for me. So this is the actual striking right now. So it's a subheading that says broad knowledge for comprehension, deep knowledge for analysis. And then he says, anything you hear or read is automatically interpreted in light of what you already know about similar subjects. And as soon as I read it, I got this vision of a spider's web. Like it was straight away. I got this vision of a spider's web, and it began to make sense. I think I must have read this maybe 2 years ago now. Just the structure of how we learn from those two short sentences began to make sense to me. And later, looking at Rosenshine and the ideas of building schema, it just clicked for me. Later in that paper, he talks about creative and critical discussions, where the gaining of knowledge is really fruitful, and how much legwork it takes to get there. And I think I'd always had that wrong at the start of my career, coming from a creative background. I loved like a creative humanities lesson or a cool science experiment, or a chance to really kind of like analyze and have a deep discussion about what we're reading as a class. But really, when I reflect on that, it's probably I probably thought I was doing a good job, because for me, my web of understanding could cope with that. But the children in my class were probably floundering in a net of misconceptions and all sorts of confusion. It's a bit like when people talk about the values that you get from stories, and that argument that like religious texts and Greek myths and things like that's where we get our values from, those stories, and almost like the need for a context within which to understand something. And for me, that paper and a lot of what Daniel Willingham does, but particularly that paper, gave me an understanding that I need to provide as wide a context for a child to understand as I possibly can before we can begin to go deeper.
Great choice.
It talks about a few things in there. Reading is mentioned, but I think it highlighted, because it talked about science and different aspects, and that need for deeper, more than context, that need for a pre-existing understanding to be able to pull up a seat at the table. And I think that's really, really what struck me from it.
And what about a research paper that every primary teacher should read?
Yeah, I've gone with a very short one in the hope that encourages people to go for it. 3 pages, so it'll take 15 minutes. Taking Curriculum Seriously by Christine Counsell. There's just so much food for thought in those 3 pages. And I like papers that don't necessarily give you all the answers, but they do act as that springboard for you to dive into another thing, or to try something out, or even to just like begin a conversation in school. And in that paper, Christine kind of explains the difference between substantive and different disciplinary knowledge. And she's asking the readers to reflect on kind of the specialized knowledge within the curriculum. And as a subject lead, that's been really helpful. And if you, I think if you read that as a staff, or on an inset, or in a staff meeting, I think you could return to that paper week after week, kind of reading more widely and building up that web of understanding, and then discussing the impact and the application of it as well across all subjects. So you could get quite a lot from that paper as a school. And I think, yeah, Christine Counsell, Claire Stoneman as well, I don't know, her blogs are on Twitter as well. They're just the 2 people that if they read, if they put anything out there, I'm like, I'm here for it. And yeah, if I was a teacher starting out, again, kind of that paper considers the complexity of curriculum that I didn't really understand until a lot later. Yeah, that idea of taking the curriculum seriously, it's just a jam-packed germ for discussion. It really is. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. Christine and Claire both get mentioned quite a bit on the podcast, and rightly so, because some of the thinking that they're doing, you know, is I think is inspiring the right word, you know, because they're just going to such depths that I'm thinking, whoa, I've never considered this, you know, and maybe it's because I'm focused on math and I don't, but yeah, I also love reading their output and listening to them speak, you know, whether it be on, you know, digitally or in person when you've got the chance. Really interesting thing came up there, just incidentally, is you know, you chose a 3-page, 15-minute article. Well, what's your approach to fitting in your professional reading? How do you tackle that?
So I find reading in short bursts a lot easier than reading for a long period of time. And I have an awful memory. So I find that quite often, certainly with novels, I could reread 3/4 of a novel before I realise I've read it before. So my reading habits aren't always great for long pieces of reading. So I'm a morning person, so I get into school pretty horrendously early, and when I do get in and I'm sorted for the day, I'd use that as an opportunity for doing some reading, perhaps for 10 or 15 minutes. But that isn't necessarily something that always happens. I know some people kind of safeguard that time. I don't necessarily do that. I do safeguard some time, sort of, so during staff meetings, if we're reading something, or we've kind of got something to take away from that, I will make sure that I've kind of reread that again in my own time. So I've got opinions on it, and I've got things that I can talk about with colleagues. And then in terms of reading, I guess I'm aware of my own reading habits. And so something like Mark Entz's book, Powerful Geography, which I read this year, that was a book that I had to make sure that I gave myself a certain number of pages a day to read. So I said, for the next 3 months or whatever, I'm going to do 10 pages a day, or however long it took. I think it was 10 pages for school weekdays, 3 months, something like that. And it just gave me that chance to kind of really prioritize it. And then I read a book called, let me get the name of this right, Classroom to Curriculum, something like that. And a much shorter book, but I again told myself, right, well, this is a shorter book, I'll read it in a fortnight. So I think certainly knowing yourself as a reader. It's the same as when we talk about reading for pleasure with kids, I guess. Knowing yourself as a reader and being able to draw up that distinction of what you can afford in terms of time for a particular point in the year, things like that, really important.
It's really interesting you said 5 days a week, because I've, not by design, but just by accident, unless I've got a deadline coming, I'll do my academic or / professional reading Monday to Friday, as often as much on my employer's time, because they know by this point that they're benefiting, because
yes.
Talking about retrieval practice in like 2017 when I took up the role, and now they're seeing that come through in official documentation. They're all, well, okay, maybe that reading that you do all the time is a benefit, but they've always supported me. They will see me reading, and I will try to be caught reading in the staff room, so because we've got this figure where you've got 25% of people are reading things that aren't things about education. I want to get as many of the 75%, to at least begin. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But I was really interested in notice that you also are a 5 day a week, and then sort of save the weekend for your fiction and stuff. Excellent.
And like sharing the reading as well. That's the other thing I'd just say is, if you've read something, sharing it with a colleague, because then that's going to guarantee a discussion if they read it too. So certainly with papers or shorter things, rather than maybe than books. Although I did it with Shannon's book, the 100 Ideas one, I did give that to our maths lead, and then that meant that we've kind of got a joint understanding of that book, and we can talk about it a bit more. So anything that kind of is going to lead to a conversation down the line is quite handy, I think.
Excellent. Yeah. I try to get maybe 2 or 3 copies of important books and have them in the staff room, and it's always empty, which is good because that means people have them. But it makes the summer, can I have all the books back, please? Yeah, no, that sounds really powerful. So all that's left to say is thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.